Thank you very much for that introduction. And to the organisers for inviting me along to this fabulous conference. When I wrote the abstract for my presentation a few months ago, I set myself a question that I have in fact found impossible to answer. And so I set myself a separate question, but I think it's in a way a substantially more important one. The post-colonial historian Dipesh Chakrabarty has ventured the profound observation that with the arrival of the Anthropocene, human history and geological history have converged. And he grapples with the question of how we can think the Anthropocene as a species question rather than one of social formations alone, without denying the fact that the archetypal anthropos of anthropogenic climate change has been male, wealthy and white. He pursues the intuition that the history of capital must be mixed somehow with the history of the species, that is, with deep history. Chakrabarty appeals in the first instance to the language of the scientists who pioneered the idea, who speak in terms of the human species. The appeal to the authority of species talk used by Earth system sciences might be met with the famous Mandy Rice-Davies retort, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? Scientists instinctively look for biological and genetic explanations. As a post-colonial historian, Chakrabarty is naturally suspicious of appeals to biological principles to explain collective human behaviour, not least for their reactionary implications. When the human species is to blame, no one is to blame. Yet he returns to the theme, sensing that there's something deeper going on that can't be captured by the social categories of capitalism or other forms of social organisation. And this striving for a new history of species thinking attracts no sympathy from historians of a more orthodox Marxist influence persuasion, including Andreas Malm and Alf Hornborg, who's with us today, who spoke earlier. There's nothing in the climate crisis or the Anthropocene that can be attributed to mankind in general, they insist. And they're hostile to the undifferentiated anthropos in the naming of the new epoch. For if we talk of the geology of mankind in general, then the new epoch must, in their words, have its roots in the properties of that being. Alternative names for the epoch, as we've heard for the last day and a half, reflecting its true origin, have been proposed: the Anglocene, the Technocene, the Capitalocene, and so on. In this view, when the scientists locate the origins of our contemporary dilemma in some genetic disposition, or the discovery of fire, or the arrival of agriculture, social scientists are obliged to challenge those framings. Reminders must be issued that we're caught in this perilous entanglement because, put crudely, of the activities of a clique of white British men and their steam engines. So it's divisions between humans rather than any homogeneity that we must look to for the origins of sociogenic climate change. Malm and Hornborg worry that species talk, such as that of Chakrabarty, will see analysis descend into, quote, mystification and political paralysis. In a reprise of Marx's notion of inherent contradictions, for them the climate crisis is a product of the imperative of accumulation and the power of capital, which treats the natural environment as a mere resource. Yet, if the earth scientists are guilty of dehistoricising and depoliticising the response to the crisis by naturalising it, are not Malm and Hornborg and several others guilty of deflating the Anthropocene by reading this most profound historical rupture into the modernist categories of the Holocene, and in particular those of Marxist materialism? For a start, the problem is not one of capitalism alone. The Soviet Union was, if anything, more guilty of the pursuit of the Promethean control and of nature and disregard for its ugly consequences. And in China, Mao declared a war on nature. And in more modern China, a strange socialist-capitalist hybrid, in a way took to new heights Mao's war against nature, which is why China has by far the highest greenhouse gas emissions in the world, even if the Chinese leadership is now looking to negotiate some kind of peace. Capitalism and socialism, both children of Enlightenment humanism and equally committed to material advance through technological industrialism, competed to see which would be its true keeper. The strongest resistance to the Promethean project has emerged within capitalist societies in the form of the ecological critique. The awkwardness of explaining the Anthropocene as arising from established theories of social conflict is the most profound challenge for an orthodox understanding. How can we ascribe wanton destruction to the hegemonic power of capital when the broad populace, whose future is being destroyed, has collaborated so willingly in the process? Despite corporate attempts to manipulate opinion and undermine science, it's not true that corporate power has somehow thwarted public demand for deep emission cuts. There's been little broad public demand for the kind of rapid transition required by the science. The public sees itself as having a stake in the very system that Malm and Hornborg accept is jeopardising the conditions of life. Although arguably this is beginning to change, it's not the case that powerful corporations and their apologists are forcing us into a dangerous new epoch against widespread resistance. Notions of false consciousness are too crude to be of any help. The more sophisticated idea of governmentality, the capacity of the system to create participants who govern themselves in ways that perpetuate the system, is more persuasive. But what is it about humans that makes us so pliable, so easily manipulated? Elsewhere, including in my book Requiem for a Species, I've enumerated the psychological coping strategies commonly deployed to resist the warnings issued by the climate scientists: blame shifting, wishful thinking, disavowal, and of course plain out denial. But to search for the roots of these predispositions in the conditions of capitalist or indeed socialist industrialisation, or even in the conditions of late consumer capitalism, would be to look in vain. Even if the invention of the lies of the climate deniers can be attributed to Exxon, the need to believe in them cannot. The seeds of doubt have been broadcast on fertile soils. The authors of the Greek myths were intimately familiar with the human frailties now in play. So, if the specific human activities that gave us the Anthropocene are rooted in technological industrialism, the susceptibilities behind our collective refusal to change cannot be so rooted. Although undoubtedly exploited by various interests, the predispositions that have given us the new geological epoch are as old as civilization. We're witnessing the wholesale failure of reason, even if the reasonable course is defined as narrowly as enlightened self-interest, which naturally leads us to consider the qualities of being human that transcend those shaped by particular social formations. In the Anthropocene, I believe, there is something grander unfolding beyond the grubby assertion of corporate power and the seductive logic of consumer capitalism. So what are we to make of Chakrabarty's intuition that there's something going on at a species level, beyond the narrative of capitalism or even industrialism? He motivates the use of species history and the universal anthropos by appealing to the natural resource limits and ecological interdependence that define us as a biological entity and from which none of us can escape. While the result of historically contingent decisions about the use of fossil fuels, for instance, the arrival of the Anthropocene brings into view our nature as a species, independent of history, but dependent on the earth we inhabit. And so Chakrabarty asks, how do we relate to a universal history of life while retaining what is of obvious value in our post-colonial suspicion of the universal? We must find a way to mix the history of capital and the history of the species. I think he poses the right question. Yet his hint at an answer, which is a kind of cross-hatching of those two histories of capital and the species, generates no real foundation beyond a call for a global approach to politics. So is there a way through the dilemma in which both the particular and the universal conceptions, taken alone, both fail? We must somehow locate the rise of technological industrialism within the broader arc of the history of the species and its disconcerting entanglement with geology. Without such a context, the arrival of technological industrialism in the 18th century is understood merely as a historical accident, born of the contingency opened up by random technological breakthroughs coupled with colonial adventurism and power shifts in England, in which case it has no link, can have no link to the history of the species. Chakrabarty himself believes we stumbled into the new era. But if some notion of the species is to be part of the story, then the rise of techno-industrialism must in some sense be contained within the larger history of humankind. That is, within a dynamic that belongs to humans in general rather than simply to modern industrial ones, but which nevertheless found its particular expression in techno-industrialism. Appeals to natural greed or the restless desire to assert dominance or some genetically imprinted competitiveness, these are impossible to defend anthropologically. Nothing in the wiring of Homo sapiens can plausibly lead to the Anthropocene. After all, this new epoch arrives after 193,000 years of humans doing not much at all except migrate and struggle to survive, followed by 7,000 years of agriculture and civilization, 300 years of industry, and 60 years of rampant growth that has seen us breach the planet's natural boundaries. Well, I think the first step to a resolution of this dilemma is to set aside the category of species, which is inescapably biological, where Homo sapiens is merely the endpoint of one branch of the tree of life. When species thinking is imported uncritically into explanations of the Anthropocene, then the scientistic epistemology of that kind of thinking is imported too. Talk of species history can't get beyond biological history. So instead of thinking in terms of the history of the species, I believe we have to think in terms of the history of humankind, with the emphasis on the uniqueness of humans, not our commonality with other creatures, with the emphasis on the uniqueness of humans, our consciousness, reflexivity, creativity, and free will, rather than what we share with other organisms, ecological limits, competition for resources, genetic inheritance, and so on. Incidentally, I often hear from scientists who, in an attempt to deflate our anthropocentrism, or indeed our anthrosupremacism, they often remind us that we share 97% of our DNA with chimpanzees, but we are not entering the Chimpocene. So these unique characteristics of humans in general make possible the specific historical conditions, social structures, inventions, politics, that were the Anthropocene's immediate cause. The second step, I think, in trying to reach a resolution is to realise that we have been trying to answer all of the big questions of the Anthropocene using only one understanding. And I think the dilemma might be resolved by distinguishing between the proximal cause of the Anthropocene and the underlying or the final cause of it. The proximal or immediate cause of the Anthropocene lies not in our species nature, but in the constellation of social and technological forces that gave rise to the Industrial Revolution in Europe and its development in various forms, including the post-war Great Acceleration. Proximal causes naturally point to the unequal and exploitative origins of the ecological crisis in the social order, and it's this frame through which the consequences and policy solutions are typically assessed. From this viewpoint, it's right to point out that the impact of the Anthropocene fall more heavily on the poor, including, of course, the poor in rich countries. The final or underlying cause of the Anthropocene is related to the question of its meaning in Earth history, in human history, and in the domain in which these two histories come together. By meaning, I mean the place and significance of the new epoch in the destiny or unfolding of humankind, as well as the place and significance of the new epoch in the destiny or unfolding of the Earth. From this perspective, then, it's natural to speak of humankind in general. In Earth history, the new epoch represents a rupture in the planet's 4.5 billion year trajectory, because for the first time, the dominant force of nature is no longer blindly responding to the laws of physics and chemistry, but contains something radically distinctive, the element of will that distinguishes humans as a species. So the Earth system has been injected with a force that is able to make decisions. If we confine our analysis to a world of social relations, this profoundly important fact is lost. To put it another way, if we take seriously Chakrabarty's observation that human history and geological history have converged, then we can think of it as the injection of the human into the natural. Against this, an appeal to the species nature of humans is an attempt to account for the other side of this relation, the injection of the natural into the human. Earth scientist James Savitsky has written, "Now we regularly decelerate and accelerate natural processes, focus energy in extraordinary ways, and alter, destroy, or create ecosystems." For a living organism to transform the Earth system as a whole is not unprecedented. Oxygenation of the atmosphere 2.4 billion years ago is attributed to cyanobacteria. Yet humans alone have the capacity to decide, in a way that cyanobacteria did not, to decide how and how much the Earth system will be transformed. We, humans, may even decide to attempt to regulate the whole system by way of geoengineering. Jacob Burckhardt wrote of human history in a kind of canonical definition. Human history is, quote, the break with nature caused by the awakening of consciousness. The consciousness he had in mind was a modern one separated from nature, so that the natural world became an inert backdrop to the drama of human affairs. When it's understood this way, history obscures the meaning of the Anthropocene, because in the new epoch, the grand story of humankind can no longer be told separately from the evolution of the Earth system. In the history of humankind, the rupture of the Anthropocene is sui generis, unclassifiable. Yet it ranks alongside the control of fire or settled agriculture, or even the arrival of multicellular life, if we're to believe Wally Brocker. It ranks the rupture of the Anthropocene alongside those events in its significance, where significance means not only its impact on the human Earth, human environment relationship, but eventually on reshaping our consciousness. Arrival of agriculture, as did the arrival of modernity, profoundly reshaped human consciousness. We can't even imagine how people thought before the arrival of modernity. And yet I'm convinced that over the next century, the Anthropocene will reshape our consciousness in a similar way. From this vantage point, the story of the proximal causes of the new epoch in the 18th century techno-industrialism can be inscribed in the larger histories of both humankind and the earth. It's an event to be understood within a conception of the unfolding of the whole. In this view, the scope of human history as conventionally conceived by Jacob Burckhardt, for example, is too narrow to encompass an event of the Anthropocene's magnitude. The customary categories of modernity, of history, rob the Anthropocene of its stunning implications. Its radical novelty is rendered prosaic if it's dealt with merely by extending the bounds of history to include the environment, or, on the other side, by modifying models of the Earth system to accommodate this new and rather unpredictable force of nature. It's not enough to accept that history now has a geological element and geology has a human element without attempting to grasp the meaning of the convergence. If the Anthropocene is not a mere accident, an event we stumbled into, then we have to ask what its arrival is revealing. What is its place in a whole that encompasses both geology and human history? If we can position ourselves to see it that way, then the Anthropocene becomes an event in a larger unfolding. Its proximal cause is brought about within that larger unfolding. In this view, the Anthropocene is not only a beginning of a new phase in human history and in Earth history, but also a completion, a culmination, the realisation of a potential that was always there with the emergence of conscious beings, even if the culmination inaugurates an epoch that no conscious being would rationally choose. So, in short, I'm arguing that what we need is a philosophy of history. That is, a narrative explanation of the unfolding of human history as a whole. Now, today, of course, philosophies of history are very much out of fashion, because reading laws into the unfolding human record seems to deprive humans of their autonomy and resurrect the long-buried idea of the guiding hand of God or the Spirit. To pose the question of meaning and posit the path of world history, it's been argued, was originally a Christian preoccupation that carried over into secular philosophies of history in early modern times. Thinkers like Kant and Hegel and then Marx, after discarding Christian answers, nevertheless felt obliged to keep the questions while providing philosophical historical answers in the space that the Christian questions left. Moreover, it's argued, totalising narratives attempted to bury a world of difference under a Eurocentric worldview. And their explicit or implicit teleology, progress towards an end point, can't be defended after human autonomy, the defining feature of modernity. The correct view today is that humans make their own futures in 1,000 unpredictable, though culturally conditioned ways, and there is no meaning to our collective existence on Earth. A philosophy of history then becomes an insult to our declaration of individuality. Well, these attacks on the idea of a philosophy of history really were fatal. Yet, I'd like to maintain, this closing 5 or 6 minutes of my talk, I'd like to maintain that the arrival of the Anthropocene legitimates new grounds for thinking about a philosophy of history. In no sense can it be a simple reinvention of the old, for a new philosophy of history must be a joined history of humans and Earth taken together. All humans are now destined to live in the Anthropocene. They're implicated not just in its impacts, but its causes too. The north-south allocation of blame is breaking down. Over 1 billion Chinese people now have around about the same average greenhouse gas emissions as the average European. And it won't be too many years before the total historical greenhouse gas emissions of China will exceed those of the United States. And India, of course, is coming up behind. Although the experience of the Anthropocene will vary widely, with the world's poor and vulnerable the most undeserving victims, not even the wealthier will escape, given their total dependence on centralised infrastructure, including supplies of energy, water and food. And of course, none will be exempt from the impacts of shifting populations and geopolitical conflict. We've all been drawn into the orbit of the Earth system, beyond our local and regional environments. Earth system science has given us a story about the Earth as a whole. It's one in which humans, not just wealthy white people, humans have entered into deep time, a force of nature to be inscribed in the geological timescale. The Anthropocene is the totalising event par excellence. Of course, local and regional environments still matter, but Earth system science tells us that we live on the Earth, which is not a mere aggregation of the local. It's a dynamic, evolving, total entity above and beyond the local, and increasingly determining what happens at the local and regional levels. But of course, there's another force that we're more familiar with that has arrived that unites humankind in a way that lends itself to a philosophy of history. The entire world has come under the influence of the many-headed monster we know as globalisation. It's meant the collapse of economic borders for corporations, trade, finance, intellectual property, and increasingly skilled labour. But above this material homogenisation, the spread of the ideology and culture of the market is almost complete. Think pop culture, Euro Disney, the internet, Zara, Apple, Longines, James Bond, smartphones, Mr. Bean, the X Factor, the Big Mac, of course, with Chinese characteristics. The astonishing force of consumerism and global brands has swept away traditional values and aspirations, replacing them with a devotion to money and materialism and the pursuit of personal identity. Hegel wrote that in the development of freedom, world history travels from east to west. He wrote, "For Europe is the absolute end of history, just as Asia is the beginning." Today, world history has made the return journey, now loaded up with the baggage of European American ideology, the heaviest piece of which is labelled growth fetishism. The era of colonialism may have ended, yet its enduring legacy has been the insatiable desire to import consumer capitalism, the West's most potent export. So while the left, I include myself, valiantly attempts to defend cultural and social difference and to use this difference as a way of attacking universalising narratives, Western narratives and aspirations blithely pursue their domination across the East. Difference, of course, still counts, but the differences cling on under the hegemony of the global. And so we gaze into the future, both of the progressive elimination of difference in a globalised world and the dawning of an Anthropocene that over the next decades must increasingly dominate everyday life and consciousness wherever one lives. These universalising, totalising forces open up space for a philosophy of history. Above the diversity stand one global economy, one global culture, one total Earth. And now, to end on this point, we must face the possibility that humankind will, through its technological disruption of the Earth system, bring about its own demise. We hear many say that it wouldn't matter. Humans came, then humans went. If human existence is meaningless, then humankind's systematic and willful destruction of the conditions of life on Earth is also meaningless. For me, there's something inhuman in such a view, one that I cannot accept. And it's for these reasons that I'm suggesting that the new material conditions open up space for a new philosophy of history, one that gives a narrative and a meaning to our place on Earth. But this time, it must be a philosophy of history that is not limited, as it was for Kant and Hegel and Marx, to the domain of human history. It must be a philosophy of human Earth history, a philosophy of geohistory. Thank you very much.